We don't need a monster of a daughter. We don't need a monster of a daughter, they said, laughing as if it was the most amusing thing in the world. My grandparents were stunned by the harsh words thrown at me. After a while, trembling with rage, they managed to say, "Then we'll take her in." My grandmother gripped my hand tightly as I cried. From that day on, I never returned to that house. It was my grandparents who took me in. Since then, I've been able to live peacefully. And then, 10 years later, a suspicious figure appeared in front of the new house my grandparents had built. "Who are you guys?" They had ragged clothes and mean-looking faces. I recognized them as my parents. "You're living in quite a big house here. It was hard to find this place. Won't you let us live here? The old house has become too cramped for us," my parents said, smirking. I frowned at them and responded clearly. "How selfish can you be? I can't believe it. After calling me a monster and all sorts of things and then abandoning me without a second thought. Leave right now, this is trespassing." My parents looked at me in surprise. I used to be scared of their reactions, but I'm not the same person anymore. I won't let them do whatever they want here. I reached for the emergency button to call the security company. "My name is Mirabelle Saavedra, I'm 22 years old. I work in beauty and live with my grandparents. I don't have parents. To be precise, I was abandoned by my parents when I was in elementary school. It was all because of my face. I have a scar from a burn. The accident left scars from the boiling water. Because of this, my life changed completely. I was called a monster by my parents every day. As a child, all I could do was cry. But now, I realize it wasn't the burn that changed my life. The real tragedy was being born to those parents in the first place. Thinking back, I always seemed to be hungry as a child. We never had much money at home. That was because my dad kept jumping from one job to another, causing trouble at work and quitting soon after. He'd then spend his days idly, gambling on things like slots. During the times my dad was unemployed, my mom would sometimes work at a bar. She was quite beautiful and always bragged about how much she was admired by men. Her favorite saying was that she used to be the top bartender when she was single. But like my dad, she wasn't cut out for work. She'd work a little and then, just like him, quit, and they both would indulge in gambling. Naturally, there was no chance they would take care of a child properly. Our meals consisted of just instant soup or mashed potatoes placed on the table, which I had to prepare by pouring hot water myself. That became a habit from my childhood because there was hardly anything else to eat. And I was always left feeling hungry. The turning point came when I was in 4th grade. One day, I went to the supermarket with my mom. And that's where we bumped into one of her old acquaintances. My mom and this lady chatted for a while, but eventually, the woman looked at me with interest and was surprised. "My goodness, your daughter? She's grown so much and is so cute. She looks just like a model." I still vividly remember the broad smile on my mom's face when she heard that. It seems that comment sparked an idea in her mind. After a discussion with my dad, in no time at all, I was registered at a child model agency. After attending a few auditions, work started coming my way. I did modeling for a small medical store's children's clothing line and local commercials for a local TV station, among other things. When money started coming in, my parents were overjoyed. Our meals went from just instant food to lavish ones, and our old clothes were replaced with brand names. What made me happiest was that my parents started treating me with smiles. Before, they seemed indifferent and uninterested in me, a child, but working changed how they treated me. They became kind. I was much happier about my parents being pleased and feeling happy myself than just being able to eat my fill. My parents were happy and so was I. But that happiness didn't last long. For better or worse, I became popular as a child model. And my parents kept piling on more work for me. Eventually, I couldn't participate in school events because of my schedule. I had no time to do homework and couldn't keep up with my studies. Of course, my body was also tired. But I thought my parents were happy. I pushed my small body to its limits and worked desperately. The work kept increasing day by day. My parents were delighted, but my body was accumulating fatigue. Around this time, my parents bought a new car and started going on luxurious trips to tourist spots all over the country. Of course, I couldn't go because I had work. It was my daily routine to go to the set by myself, finish the shoot, and then head to the next one alone. The luxurious meals we used to eat together gradually became just me eating instant food alone again. That made me sad. Hey, Mom, Dad, can I take a break from work? I want to go to school and eat meals together again. When I muttered this, my parents argued back. What are you talking about? This is the prime time to earn money. Work is more important than school. Don't worry, Mirabelle. We're enjoying and making good use of the money you're earning. Work is what you should be focusing on. I understand now. My parents didn't have any affection for me. They only saw me as a golden goose that brought in money. Eventually, I reached 6th grade. But my days were still filled with work. I was constantly exhausted and staggering from lack of sleep. Then, at one point, an accident happened. It was during a break in the shooting, while I was about to eat instant soup in the dressing room. I boiled water in the studio's kitchen as usual. Holding the kettle was fine, but I stumbled from sleep deprivation and fell. Oh no! Screaming in pain as the boiling water from the kettle I was holding splashed over my face. It's hot! Someone help me! I cried out from the unbearable heat. The filming crew rushed over and took me to the hospital right away. Not sure if the nurses called them, but by the time the treatment was done, my parents had arrived. Unfortunately, the water had splashed on my face. It led me to severe burns. I had to spend the following weeks wrapped in bandages and going to the hospital for treatment. Then, a few weeks later, it was time to remove the bandages. My parents watched anxiously as they were taken off. I was in shock when I saw my reflection. A terrible scar, like a ghastly bruise, had formed. I broke down crying, but my parents were even more shocked than I was. Doctor, this isn't Mirabelle's face. You have to fix her up more beautifully. The doctor sighed. We did everything we could. Any more treatments would only make it a little lighter at best. Hearing this, my parents turned pale. The real nightmare began then. Of course, I had to cancel all my child model gigs. With these scars, there was no way I could continue working in a job that required a certain look. But what hurt me the most wasn't the loss of work, it was my parents' reaction. This was unexpected. And we still have payments left on the new car. Exactly, we had plans for you to work much more, but now with this hideous face. You're of no use. My parents blamed the accident on my carelessness. And became ice cold in their demeanor towards me. I was deemed worthless as a product to them. I couldn't say anything back. It was all my fault for being careless. My dad and mom don't need me with this face. It was heartbreaking, but there was nothing I could do about it. One day, when I was coming back from school, I overheard my parents whispering in the living room. They hadn't noticed I was home yet. I couldn't help but hide and eavesdrop. I'm so disappointed in her. I thought she'd bring in more money. Now, she's just a leech, costing us for food and school. Yeah. We even thought about getting her into night work, but with that face, that's out of the question. Such a waste. But we still have the car loan and other debts, so she'll have to work something, maybe a paper route? That won't make much money. She's worthless now, might as well dump her somewhere. Maybe if we leave her in front of a foster care, someone will pick her up. I was frozen on the spot by their cruel words. Sure, I was sad about the burned scars on my face, but I was somewhat relieved I could cancel my modeling jobs. I thought I could finally go to school, study, and play with friends. But my parents didn't care about how I felt. They were even thinking about abandoning me. Trying to leave quietly, I accidentally made a noise. Realizing I was there, my parents came out of the living room. Seeing me pale, their expressions remained cold. "You heard us? Well, that makes things easier. Leave this house." "That's right. Supporting you is too much. Now we can finally breathe easier." "No way!" I thought it was just too cruel. Kids my age live with caring parents, eat warm home-cooked meals, enjoy studying, sports, and hanging out with friends. Meanwhile, I was just used and then discarded like trash. Tears naturally started falling from my eyes. But my mom showed no mercy. "Crying is useless. Do you understand? What's your answer?" To me, my parents seemed nothing less than monsters. I was speechless, just standing there silently when the front door opened. And then, surprisingly, two people walked in. They were an elderly couple. We were worried and thought we'd check in, and sure enough. "What are you doing, Wade, Ellie?" The elderly man called out my parents by their names. My father let out a displeased grunt. "What? Dad, Mom? Why are you here?" I recognized them the moment I saw them. Though we had rarely met, they were my paternal grandparents. I heard that my grandparents and my father never really got along. My father was born into a wealthy family as an only son. He was influenced by bad friends at school and strayed off the right path. He got into trouble and was often picked up by the police. Despite my grandparents' efforts, my father didn't change. Even as an adult, he hardly worked, spending his days at bars and nightclubs. When he suddenly married my mother, who worked as a hostess, my grandfather was so angry he kicked them out of the house. Since then, they hadn't been very active in our lives, but it seemed they still cared about me, their granddaughter. "Grandma, Grandpa?" I murmured, and they looked at me tenderly. We saw Mirabelle in a clothing store flyer and were surprised. "We hadn't heard anything from Wade and were worried about how you were doing." "Wade, you're the worst. Kicking her out, no, you've never changed since then. And Ellie, what kind of adults make their child work and then discard her when she's no longer useful? What are you thinking?" My father looked annoyed at my grandfather's lecture. "Shut up. Coming here all of a sudden just to lecture us?" While giggling, my mother retorted. "Well, it can't be helped. Mirabelle's got no more value with a face like that." "Don't be ridiculous. She isn't just some tool. Have you not noticed how skinny she is, and you barely feed her properly? And what about this bruise on her face? Was that an accident? Poor thing. You two are unfit parents. Ganging up on a child with such cruelty. Shame on you." My grandparents scolded my parents and hugged me tightly. It was rare for me to be embraced by adults, so I was surprised. Tears welled up in my eyes at the warmth of their touch. My mother, unfazed, twisted her face and spewed profanities. "If we're unfit parents, then isn't she an unfit child? She's only good for her face. It was her duty to earn money with that face and give it back to us. In this world, it's all about looks, you know? If you have a good face, you can make money. But with her turning ugly, she's worthless. Good for nothing." My mother's words enraged my grandparents. "How dare you say such things? We don't need a monster of a daughter. We don't need a monster of a daughter." Laughing, my parents said. My grandparents were stunned by the harsh words thrown at me. After a while, trembling with rage, they managed to say, "Then we'll take her in." My grandmother cried as she tightly squeezed my hand. From that day on, I never returned to this house. I don't remember much about what happened after. There was an exchange between adults, and I was officially taken in by my grandparents. My grandmother served delicious meals, and I could sleep soundly in warm blankets. That was what made me happier than anything else. Since it was just the right time for middle school, I enrolled in a middle school near my grandparents' home. Finally, I was able to live a normal child's life. I was falling behind in my studies, but my grandmother hired a tutor, and I managed to catch up. Then, I wanted to make friends and have fun, but I was worried about my burn scars. People might not like it. I feared being rejected or called a monster like my parents used to say. But I didn't need to worry. My grandparents found a makeup artist through their connections, someone who had worked backstage before. She was a beautiful woman and did my makeup. I was amazed when I looked in the mirror after she was done. The burn scars were gone. It was like magic.
See, you look beautiful now. It's okay, have confidence,
she said, and I couldn't help but exclaim in joy.
Yes. Amazing. Thank you, Mary.
Gradually, I regained my confidence, as she said. I used to be timid, afraid of upsetting my parents, but I started speaking up more. At school, I made friends and started having fun. My grandparents watched me happily. All these happy days were thanks to my grandparents. I was incredibly grateful to them. 10 years have passed since then. I'm now a working adult. The scars on my face have faded significantly and are almost unnoticeable. Thanks to my improved makeup skills. My grandparents are still doing well. They built a new house after that. They owned several apartments and had rental income. Though they were well off, they lived modestly and refused to give money to my father, their son. They even talked about donating the money they didn't need. They took me in because they were thinking about my future. Our old house was getting old too, so they built a new one to ensure we could live comfortably. So now, we live in a newly built house that's 18,000 square feet. One night, I overheard my grandparents talking with worried faces. There's been a suspicious person lurking around our house recently. They're dressed in ragged clothes, looking like a family. Maybe they're beggars. I saw them again just now, and it's quite frightening. Really? That's creepy. Worried by what I heard, I decided to go outside to check. It's unusual for our peaceful neighborhood to have suspicious people. I thought if I saw nothing, my grandparents would be relieved. But the moment I stepped out the gate, I saw an unexpected sight. It was a family dressed in shabby clothes. They must be the suspicious people my grandmother mentioned. A middle-aged man and woman, with two girls who seemed to be their children. They were leaning against our house wall, mumbling something. Their presence was eerie, but more than that, I was annoyed they were loitering around someone's home. I heard a shout, "Mirabelle." Why did these people know my name? Suspicious, I asked them. "Who are you?" Then, a familiar sweet voice responded.
"Oh, Mirabelle, have you forgotten us? It's your mom and dad."
What? Upon closer inspection, the middle-aged couple was indeed my parents. They've aged a lot since then. Perhaps it's because their faces have become gaunt. You're living in such a big house now. It was hard to find this place. After you left, our family grew, and our house became too small. So, we were hoping you'd let us live here. My father said, smirking, with two girls standing expressionlessly beside him, one about middle school age and the other about elementary school age. Both were strikingly beautiful. Could it be that my parents had more children after I left? Would that make them my sisters? I couldn't believe it, and my disbelief was apparent. Whether their family had grown or not, it had nothing to do with me. How audacious of them to just show up like this. I yelled loudly.
"How selfish can you be? I can't believe it. After calling me a monster and all sorts of things, then abandoning me without a second thought. Go back home now."
My parents looked surprised at my response. The days I used to be afraid of displeasing them seemed like a lie.
"Mirabelle, how can you say that to your parents? I thought only your face was ugly, but it turns out your heart is too. You're no parents of mine."
The moment I retorted, the front door opened. My grandparents had come out of the house, noticing the commotion. "Wade, Ellie.
Grandma, Grandpa, these people suddenly showed up saying they want to live here. It's unbelievable they come out of nowhere now.
My father quickly interrupted my words.
What are you talking about, Mirabelle? This is my parents' house. We have the right to live here.
My grandfather spoke with a weary face, as if lecturing my father.
I'm afraid that right no longer exists.
What?
We've disowned you. Don't you dare step over this threshold again.
Firmly, my grandfather confronted my yelling father. Huh? You think that argument is going to fly? My parents persisted stubbornly. The girls had complex expressions on their faces while my parents shook the gate.
What are you doing? This is trespassing. I'm calling the security company,
I said, pressing the emergency button for the security company. It was a good decision to have it installed given the size of our new home. Soon, a loud alarm sounded, attracting neighbors and passers-by. My parents turned pale and fled in panic. Mirabelle, are you okay? Really, those two never learn. Yes, I'm fine. But something was on my mind. Those two girls. Did my parents mean they were my sisters when they said the family had grown? They must be suffering under those parents, just like I did. The thought made me feel uneasy. Time passed. Just to be safe, I spoke to the police and asked for patrols around our house. Thanks to that, my parents hadn't come back since. Life returned to its peaceful routine. Then, one day, returning from work, I saw unfamiliar people standing in front of our house. I tensed up for a moment, but then realized they were still children. And these were familiar somehow. Could it be the children from that time? The middle school girl and the elementary school girl who were with my parents. The older girl noticed me and spoke in a small voice. I'm sorry, we have nowhere else to go, so we came here. They were thin and had dark circles under their eyes. What happened? We ran away from that house. What? Please, help us. I was taken aback by the sudden turn of events. For a moment, I wondered if they were my parents' accomplices, but they were still children. I decided to at least listen to what they had to say. For safety, I didn't invite them into the house but took them to a nearby cafe instead. The older girl was Amelia, and the younger one was Lisa. They shared their story about my parents. We were taken from a foster care. So, you're not their biological children? I asked, and they shook their heads. I had been curious about how my parents had been living after I left. Amelia explained that my parents had reluctantly started working, but soon quit and returned to their aimless lifestyle. They then plotted to have another child who could be their new source of income. However, they couldn't have children of their own, and started picking out cute kids from foster care to adopt. My parents had set their sights on Amelia and Lisa because they were beautiful girls. They took them in and made them work as child actors and baby models. You only have your looks going for you, they were told, almost brainwashing them to believe it. But even that didn't work out. Now, they couldn't earn as much as they did before. My parents told me that even with their combined income, they did not make as much as I did in my prime. Plus, they continued to spend lavishly, always struggling financially. That's when they decided to come to this house, my father's childhood home. Initially, they intended to ask for money, but seeing how large the house was, they thought it would be better to just live here. However, after being turned away by me, they had no choice but to flee. The problem was what happened next. My parents aren't the type of people to give up after just one setback. They started concocting another reckless plan, gathering what little money they had to go gamble in an overseas casino, hoping to increase their funds. I was dumbfounded. It was just like my gambling-loving, work-hating parents to come up with something like that. But Amelia and Lisa were a problem for their plan. They were told to stay home and watch the house while my parents were abroad. Apparently, my parents have been overseas for several weeks now, and they were told to house sit. They have been abroad for a few weeks now and have no money or food at home. Amelia and Lisa were originally told that they did not have to go to school and had been truant. Because of this, the adults around them, such as their school teachers, were unaware of the situation at home. They had been surviving on whatever was in the fridge, but they had reached their limit. How terrible. I sighed after hearing their story. My parents only saw children as a source of income. Just like with me, but now it seemed even worse. We thought about going back to the child welfare office, but our parents told us don't tell the office, so we had nowhere to ask for help and came here. Amelia said with a weary voice. I'm hungry. Lisa muttered, reminding me of myself. I too was always hungry when I lived in that house. Thinking of Amelia and Lisa's daily life made my heart ache. I couldn't leave them alone. I decided to let Amelia and Lisa come into my home. And explained everything to my grandparents. My grandmother was shocked but made warm meals for the two of them. My grandfather listened seriously and joined me in anger. Amelia and Lisa cried tears of joy as they ate. Seeing that, I was filled with an indescribable sense of anger. Grandma, Grandpa. We can't just leave things as they are. What my parents are doing is neglect, isn't it? Let's report them to the police. My grandparents nodded in agreement. It's inhuman to put young children through such an ordeal. They need to understand just how terrible their actions are. The next day, we visited my parents' house. The house I once lived in was in a terrible state. Cluttered and dusty as if it hadn't been cleaned for years. We grimaced at the sight. My parents were, of course, not there. They hadn't returned from overseas yet. My grandmother sighed.
Nothing has changed. Taking in children for the sake of money when they can't even raise them. Unbelievable.
Our anger reached its peak. We reported to the police and explained the situation. We were interviewed and we told them what had happened. According to the police, there had been reports from neighbors, and child welfare services had tried to visit. But my parents had turned them away every time. We are taking good care of our children. If you doubt us, we'll sue for defamation, they had retorted aggressively. Unbelievable people. While we were speaking with the police inside the house, the door suddenly opened. My parents had returned. What? Why? My parents were shocked to see the police. They looked worn out. Apparently, their plan to make money at the casino had failed. They tried to flee, but it was too late. The police detained them, and they were arrested for parental neglect.
Hey, what's going on?
What do you mean, Mirabelle? Mom, Dad. You set us up, how could you? I was utterly disgusted by my parents yelling and accusations at this point.
Set you up? Don't be ridiculous. This is the result of your neglect, isn't it? Not just towards me but towards Amelia and Lisa too, using us all just so you could have an easy life. And then, on top of that, you crush the spirits of your children with nothing but cruel words. You are failures, not just as parents but as human beings. You deserve to be locked up in a cold cell and reflect on your actions to your very bones.
My parents, perhaps overwhelmed by my fury, twisted their faces and couldn't muster a rebuttal as they were led away by the police. I can't imagine them changing their ways easily, but leaving them to their own devices was far too dangerous. I felt a temporary relief as they were arrested. I didn't want any more children to become their victims. I hope that such parents disappear from this world. That's what we wished for as we left the house. Later on, they were sentenced. It turned out to be 5 years in prison. The abuse of the adoption system and their egregious actions led to a relatively long sentence for parental neglect. In court, my parents seemed to apologize to the children. But whether they truly felt remorse was dubious. In prison, they reportedly had quite a defiant attitude. Due to the sensational nature of the news, journalists visited my parents for interviews. One reporter shared that my parents demanded money in exchange for interviews. It led even the journalists astounded by their greed. It made me sick to realize how avaricious they were. It seems people don't change that easily after all. All I can do now is to ensure I never have anything to do with them again. Afterward, Amelia and Lisa were temporarily returned to child services. And they were adopted by a kind foster family. It seems to be going well this time, which is a relief. I had a chance to speak with Amelia and Lisa before they were taken in by their new family. There was something I needed to tell them. You might have heard a lot of terrible things from them, but it's best to forget. What truly matters isn't your appearance, it's your heart. It's important to have compassion for others, to keep looking forward and not give up, no matter what. If you do, someday, someone will surely take notice. Just like my grandparents rescued me from that hellish life. The first time I met Amelia and Lisa, their expressions were gloomy. But now, they're starting to regain the sparkle that's characteristic of children. Their lifestyle had been irregular, so there were some noticeable skin issues, but I taught Amelia and Lisa some basic skincare. Being children, all they needed was some simple moisturizer and lip balm, but it worked wonders. Their already cute faces brightened even more. Amelia and Lisa were surprised when they saw their faces in the mirror.
Wow, Mirabelle, you're amazing. Thank you.
I smiled, seeing a reflection of my past self in them. I'm a makeup artist by profession. Having my makeup done back then helped me gain confidence. I've always hoped to cheer up kids like them. I want Amelia and Lisa to look forward and walk confidently. I truly wish that from the bottom of my heart. Beside me, my grandfather smiles kindly. Though I wasn't fortunate with my parents, my grandparents have always been there for me. Just thinking about it made me feel happy. I still want to show my gratitude to them. I turn to my smiling grandparents and say, "Please, live a long life." My grandmother laughs and says, "Of course," while my grandfather nods with a smile.